Well, with us this morning to discuss that, a fellow Thought for the Day contributor, Raquel McKee.
Hello.
Hello, Raquel. The commentator, Sara Cook. Morning, Sara.
Good morning.
Catholic priest, Father Martin Magill. Morning, Martin. And from Atheist Ireland, Michael Nugent. Hello, Michael.
Hello.
So, interesting thoughts, Martin. And because Chris mentions about people coming up and, enjoying lots of different parts of it. What about those almost religious? Have you met the almost religious?
I have. And one of the things that Chris says there, that, people that are in a sense actually would be attracted by some elements of the church, maybe have had a very good experience of the minister or priest. But I suppose the reality is actually that for so many of them that I have met, they believe in God, but yet the actual practice or discipline of going regularly to church just doesn't come easy to them.
One of the things that I did recently was I said to a friend of mine, when I pray, I always pray out loud. And I thought to myself, actually, do you even need to pray out loud? Does anything need to be manifested into the world, or can you, be within yourself saying prayers and not letting anyone else know about it?
I think it's a combination of both, actually, because I think there's a real value, of course, in praying aloud. And I suppose, if I think of Catholic liturgy, for example, it's actually very powerful. It's an amazing experience whenever there's a congregation fully participating in the Mass, a real sense of that dialogue between the celebrant and the congregation, which of course the whole focus, of course, is on God the Father. And yet at the same time, within liturgy, and of course within our own private prayer, the real need for silence.
Sarah, you're nodding there. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that for many people, church is so vitally important because our lives are so busy. And so for people who are very keen to practice their faith, church carves out that time to really do it, and even to focus for an hour and a half each week on spiritual thoughts and on your own spiritual practice. I think conversely, though, one of the difficulties of our current society is that really for the first time in modern history, we have many households with two people working. Many people are working full-time in both of those cases. And so Sunday also offers this really rare and special time just to decompress and to not engage in anything formal or structured, so not leaving the house and just having some time as a family or having some downtime on your own. My father's a pastor, so I grew up going to church every Sunday of my life and many, many, many days of the week as well. And around the time our children were born, circumstantially, my husband and I didn't attend church for the first time.
Did you miss it?
Well, at first, but I have to say, we kind of said this could be a dangerous equation because we loved spending time at home. It felt very holy and it felt very sacred, actually, having that time just as a family and uninterrupted. So I think it's tricky. I know a lot of people my age who still are going to church who would go twice a month. The compromise is 2 or 3 times a month and 1 or 2 Sundays off to be with the family, maybe walking by the sea or doing something that brings them a sense of real life and connection to God. So it's a conundrum. I think church, in a sense, probably for some people is more important than it's ever been, and then for others, more challenging to actually make that time in that space.
How does all this talk of church resonate with you, Michael, from Atheist Ireland?
Well, I think church provides things that people need as human beings. It provides a sense of community. It gives you an opportunity to be absorbed in an activity that's important to you, and there's various things like that. But those are things that you can also get from other experiences. There's the psychology of what's called the psychology of optimal experience. It's sometimes called flow. Is that that when you're absorbed in activity just for its own sake rather than for something else, and you can become so familiar with the basics that you notice more nuances, you lose sense of time and space, and they're things that you can get through religion, but you'd also get them through other things. And I think if I was a religious person and if I were rather running a church or something like that, I'd be more concerned about people who are almost atheists than are almost religious, because that's the direction that things are moving. It's certainly in the developed world. Religion is becoming stronger in the developing world, and that's where the demographics certainly of Christianity is moving towards. But in the developed world, the World Values Survey has shown that as individuals move away from survival values and towards self-expression values, that societies move away from traditional religious values and towards secular rational values, and that's what's happening in certainly in Western Europe.
Indeed, and Raquel McKee is with us here. And Raquel, you're also a Thought for the Day contributor. And
that's right.
Do you get feedback from your thoughts for the day, and how has your own experience in religion resonate with what we've been hearing so far?
Yeah, I do get feedback from various people who listen to my thoughts, and of course the people who are commenting are people who would be inclined towards religion or inclined towards relationship with God. So I suppose that should be taken in the whole mix. My thought about the whole thing is that the postmodernist school of thought is very popular today. A lot of people don't see that truth can be known, that there are no absolutes, that there's a never-ending conversation. They try to keep everything open for what we can learn from each other. So it's very easy nowadays to subscribe to the thought that there can't be one right way, and that could be the reason that some people stop short of subscribing to a belief system. However, that same school of thought provides for me the freedom to hold to my belief that Jesus is who he said he is. As C.S. Lewis has challenged, is he a lunatic or is he who he says he is?
Funny you should mention C.S. Lewis. We were talking about mentioning him earlier on the programme. But Martin, does that terrify you when Raquel talks about no absolutes? Are you founded on absolutes in your position as a priest in the Catholic Church?
Well, I suppose that sense of, some of the basics, whether I would necessarily use the word absolutes or not. So some of the basics are still there for me and they're fundamental. So the likes of the commandments, the likes of the teachings of Jesus, etc. So for me, I suppose to some extent they are, yes, absolutes. And yet at the same time, I suppose there's such validity in it. We're going through a particular time. Michael's referred to the change, particularly in Western democracy, etc. And yes, obviously, in terms of developing countries, the greater move towards religion. And yet at the same time, I suppose the reality is we as human beings will not change. We are weak, fragile, frail, and at the end of the day, mortals who will eventually die. And so to some extent, no matter what, we will still be addressing some of the same basic questions.
We do indeed. And Michael, I mean, you say you're almost atheist, you mentioned earlier on. Does that mean, what is the shape of your own Sunday then? Is your Sunday different from any other day of the week?
No, not particularly. I mean, it's... Well, I personally, because I work freelance, I don't have that structure that most people would have anyway of the weekend being particularly different than the rest. But from people that are involved in Atheist Ireland, Sunday they would have different things. Some of them might go to a football match. Some of them might, just spend some time with their family. Most people do take a break for a day. But what religion traditionally has done is that it has hijacked normal human things. Like morality is a normal human thing. It's an evolved capacity in our brain based on empathy and compassion and cooperation and reciprocity and sense of fairness and justice. And both that type of philosophical approach to life and also activities, what religion has successfully done over the generations is hijack those and act as if they are religious things rather than just human things. And as the world's value survey shows, as people move away from that and societies become more secular, people realise that they can get all of these benefits. They can act kindly and justly, and they can have a sense of who they are and a sense of their relationship with something wider than them, which mightn't be church anymore. It's more often the environment, climate change, human rights, things like that are just as important to secular people as religious beliefs are to religious people.
If you just joined us, we're talking about the almost believers, people who tick all the spiritual boxes but don't go to church. What, if anything, would make them cross that front door? With us this morning, Radio Ulster Thought for the Day contributor Raquel Stewart, the commentator Sara Cook, Catholic priest Father Martin Magill, and from Atheist Ireland, Michael Nugent, whom you just heard. Now, Sarah, you mentioned that when children were small, maybe getting to church not quite so easy. Did you notice a difference then from that family day that you'd started to have of just maybe rest and reflection, rest with small children? Perhaps not, but a different kind of day. Did you notice a difference then when you started going back to church?
Yes, I did, and it's interesting. I was really fascinated by what Michael was just saying there, because I think, humans do tend to make meaning out of life. We are meaning makers, and so we find different ways to make meaning, whether that's in a formal structure like church or whether you do that on your own. So we found that those days as families were really meaningful. You know, we found ways to set new rhythms and to find quiet and to find space and in ways that we probably couldn't have at church. But then the converse of that, of course, is that when you're in church, you have that social connection that Chris mentioned in his Thought for the Day piece, and you have that corporate worship and that corporate experience of understanding who God is to us as people. And I do think that that's important. I think what's going to be challenging for the church into the future is finding ways to, I suppose, lasso this younger generation that is used to finding meaning and making meaning on its own. So young people are used to taking self-directed approaches towards everything: music consumption, social life on the internet, everything is self-directed. And I think that's going to be true as well of church engagement. I mean, the Pew Trust has just put out some research saying that for people under 40 globally, the trend is that people do not identify with religious groupings. And certainly we see in the UK that only 17% of young people would identify as being Christian. So we see that there is this drift away from organized religion. And I think what's going to be challenging for the church is to not only offer what it's always offered, those wonderful opportunities for corporate worship and collective understanding, but also for social change. I think the church is often perceived by this younger generation as being on the wrong side of history, with things like the inclusion of LGBT Christians, amongst a whole variety of other issues. And I think that's going to be a challenge for the church. How can the church show the love of Christ actively in the world by its actions, corporately and collectively, as well as allowing people opportunities to come together for worship? So I think it's going to be really interesting to see the church corporately across the world decides to, or not, engage with that big question over the next number of years.
Well, we talk about going to church, Martin. Well, when did going to church start? You know, how did that all start? And I think about times also when religion was oppressed. I think of things like the mass stones, for example, in Scotland, for example, when priests were taking outdoor masses. And so when did we start actually going to church?
Well, I suppose if we go back into the early history of the church, and we go back around the time of Constantine, when at that time Christianity was especially persecuted. So it was around Constantine it's believed some sort of conversion experience around the year 311, coming in a sense to a personal faith, and then at that stage really became very sympathetic and even in a sense almost like established, to use a more modern word, Christianity. And from that point of view, as the emperor almost saw it as his responsibility to ensure the spiritual lives of the people who were living in the empire. Now, the other issue that you touch on is in terms of penal days, and obviously when you mentioned Scotland, but certainly here in Ireland, there was a huge issue, of course, during the persecution when the likes of non-established churches, so the likes of the Presbyterians as well, etc., as the Catholics, were actually persecuted for their faith. And so in a sense, actually, that the worship continued. Really, in many ways, people prepared to give up their lives, so much so to continue going to church, celebrating Mass, at times in the likes of Woods, etc.
Well, so we managed all right without church for 3 centuries, Raquel. Do you think that we can manage all right without churches again? Or is that, I mean, Sarah was talking about young people. There is also a huge vibrancy for young people in some churches. I mean, I've been in churches where the congregations are very youthful. We have quite a different vibe coming out. But there's always that feeling of being uplifted. Is that why we like to go? And could we find that somewhere else? Could we go to a sporting event and find it on a Sunday? Many, many more sporting events these Sundays. Go to the pub on Sunday, find it there. Well, what do you think, Raquel?
I think Michael is right that people do find other avenues for some of the needs that church answers. However, that's not all that church is. Fundamentally, the idea is about faith, about people believing in God, and that is what carries them along to the practice of going to church. I mean, Martin talked earlier about some of the times when it's been difficult for people to go to church. I thought immediately of when missionaries went out to the Caribbean to minister to slaves, And there they met huge complications. Because first of all, there was the ban on educating the slaves, and there was a ban on black people actually travelling about after their working hours. So going to church was a big deal, and it was very difficult for that for that to become a reality for black Christianity. And of course, it meant that the order of the day had to readapt and adjust things. Like Sarah was saying, that, nowadays there are changes that are happening and churches have to adapt and change. Two things come to my mind. One is Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, which says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. It is important to us. It's important for the two-way relationship that was mentioned earlier, the dialogue Martin mentioned between, ourselves, as well as the vertical dialogue between us and God. The other thing that comes to mind is that churches need to make the connection with individuals. Do they want to be encouraged? Do they want to actually cross the threshold and become believers? If they do, we need to pray. We need to find out what the blockages are, and we need to pray. Then, without deviating from, I don't want to say the hard and fast stuff, but the fundamental biblical teaching to try to meet the individuals at their point of need and pray. And then encourage people along their faith journey, because we can encourage people along their faith journey, but salvation is really God's job.
Michael, what do you think of that? Salvation is God's job. Do you find that you can get there without God?
Well, if you take the Bible, or the equivalent of the Quran in other religions, you're essentially trying to sell to a modern day audience a book that says you should stone a woman to death for not being a virgin on her wedding night. It says you should stone a man to death for not gathering sticks on the Sabbath. And whatever way you try to dress that up, people just aren't going to buy that anymore, and particularly young people. There was a European social survey of 22 countries a couple of years ago, and what it found in terms of people between 16 and 29 is that in most European countries, most young people say they've no religion. There are no European countries where most people attend a religious service every week. In a third of the countries, most young people never attend a religious service, and there are only 4 European countries, which are Poland, Israel, Portugal and Ireland, where more than 1 in 10 young people attend a religious service every week. So that's the landscape. It's very bleak if you're trying to push a religious perspective, and particularly if you're trying to do it on a kind of fundamentalist biblical basis. Even from a Catholic perspective, the Pope a couple of years ago did a general audience on why go to Sunday Mass. And he was talking about Vatican Council II, confirming that Sunday is the primordial day of celebration, which must be proposed and inculcated in the piety of the faithful. You're not going to sell that today.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned those 4 countries, because, of course, we are in one of those 4 countries, Michael. So perhaps things not quite so bleak here. What would you answer to that?
Well, 1 in 10. What we say, that's ones that they're the only ones where more than 1 in 10 young people attend a religious service every week. That's and the Ireland is the lowest to that. It's 15%.
Yes, and a huge change, obviously, from times gone past. Sarah, did you grow up in the kind of household that I did, where you went to morning service, you went to Sunday school, you possibly also went to evening service as well? So the whole of the Sabbath was taken up with going to church. And how did you feel when you were a child doing that?
Do you know, I felt it to be very comforting.
Yes.
I really enjoyed church connection growing up. I was very lucky in that my pastor father and pastor's wife mother were very open people who encouraged questioning. When we were on holiday, we would go visit other churches and other places of faith practice outside of Christianity. But they really instilled the importance of rhythms of church life and participation for our family. And I loved it. And I have to say, my young children love love church as well. So on those Sundays when my husband and I are going, oh, could we just sit and read the paper for a little longer, have another cup of coffee? It's the kids going, come on, get in the car, it's time to go to church. So there is something I think particularly valuable for children in creating those rhythms of faith practice. And, if they walk away from that later or if they choose something different, that's up to them.
It's up to them. There's always a possibility of coming back onto that road again, Martin, and that would be something that you would see. The difficulty, perhaps, once you get past the kind of the younger child, and I mean, Michael was speaking about young people, what about those teenagers that are so important to have, perhaps if we say some kind of moral compass is an important thing?
Well, I mean, just for a moment or two, just to focus on those teenagers, and the reality is certainly in the likes of St John's where I am, we don't have vast numbers of them. We've a small number of them. Now, I suppose for us, the advantage of a small number is the very fact that they can be more involved, and quite a number of those teenagers are. But one of the things that I would find, and I do a bit of outreach when I can on a Saturday evening into the Falls Park, and sadly sometimes into the city cemetery, where there's quite a large number of teenagers who would gather to socialise. But one of the things that I would find is, whilst on the one hand they're coming absolutely nowhere near church, and yet at the same time there's a sense of, will you say a prayer for me?
Is there
will
still
you
that
ask me to
sense of
bless?
respect then for you?
There is that, provided they haven't too much alcohol, and that respect goes out the window. But to go back to that, I mean, the numbers that will ask for a blessing and the number will ask for prayer, and the numbers will talk about dead relatives, etc. So there certainly is something there. I would encounter very, very few atheists. I've certainly encountered a number of young people who will describe themselves as atheist, but I've certainly, as I say, come across others who regularly will ask for prayer.
Well, that's kind of batting it back into your court, Michael, but I'll just have a couple of thoughts from Raquel on that. Growing up with young people and the young people coming in and the fresh blood coming into the church, that is an important thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. I'm a mother of 4 boys, so this is real for me.
What age are those boys?
Oh, I have boys from in their 20s down to age 10.
Right, okay.
So, yes.
And I'll just add at this point, Raquel looks about 20 herself, so we're all astonished. Yeah.
So, especially in the teenage years when young people begin to question and to challenge, it is real. And as Sarah was saying, there is some mileage and some value in having had the rhythms of life beforehand, with teaching that establishes the belief system of the family beforehand, and young people will then question those values as they grow, and they will then have to make their own decisions. But I think for me, the fundamental thing is that religion and religiosity, church going, is actually a completely different conversation from what I'm interested in and concerned about, which is faith, which is actually knowing God. And as my nephew Niall, who passed away last year, would say, don't just believe, know God. And for me, that's the heart of it. If people want to cross over to that, then that's the real heart of it.
Thank you very much, Raquel. And a quick final thought from you, Michael?
Well, I think faith is an unreliable way of understanding the world, because it results in people looking at the same evidence and coming to different conclusions, and that applying reason to evidence results in people coming to the same conclusions and is more likely to be reliable. But I want to finally say that Atheist Ireland, obviously we don't believe in God, but we do work with religious organisations such as the Evangelical Alliance of Ireland and the Ahmadi Muslim Community of Ireland on human rights issues and secular issues. So the idea of being good or bad or having a moral compass isn't exclusive to either atheists or religious people.
Thank you very much indeed. And our discussion this morning coming from Raquel McKee, Sara Cook, Father Martin Magill, and as you just heard, Michael Nugent from Atheist Ireland. So